Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So I just watched The Irregulars on Netflix. Let's talk about it. So The Irregulars on Netflix is a series created by Tom Bidwell that centers around the characters of the Irregulars, who are actually a part of Arthur Conan Doyle's original Sherlock series, I believe. In the books, the Irregulars are a bunch of street urchins who help Sherlock out whenever he needs to gather some intel from the streets. We've seen examples of them previously, for example, in BBC's Sherlock, where Sherlock utilizes, the people on the streets, the people who are in the know, in order to gather more intel that he perhaps may not have access to. So the Irregulars kind of fall under this category in the stories. In this series, instead, we're dealing with a group of eclectic, kind of down on their luck teenagers who are part of this like mini little family. They've created a family amongst themselves because they basically have no one else in their lives. So because of their downtrodden circumstances, they've united together to create a family of their own. Now, this eclectic bunch actually ends up being employed by one Dr. John Watson in order to help him figure out these mysteries, these crimes that are surging through the streets of Victorian London, whilst at the same time there is this undercurrent, this sinister underlayer that is afoot, and they're trying to figure out, these crimes of the week, whilst at the same time seeing the lines that can be drawn from the overarching story that has very supernatural elements to it. So having given you guys this breakdown of the series overall, I have to say that just hearing it from my own words, it sounds interesting. Like, I can understand why Netflix would greenlight this thing. I mean, it's very much a Netflix type of storyline to follow, so it all makes sense, okay? But the thing is, I watched the 8 episodes and I have to tell you, does it live up to the potential of a premise that I just explained? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. We're going to dive into my thoughts on this series overall, but just know, the whole time I was like, oh God, oh no, please, no, why? No, please, why? Is it not every day that I have to suffer? Is it not? Just when things are getting good, we're getting Falcon and the Winter Soldier, we're getting Invincible over on Amazon Prime, and then I had to sit through this. I was like, oh, never mind. I was having a good weekend, but never mind. So we're going to dive into my thoughts on the series overall. But before we do so, as per usual, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and make sure you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. Without further ado, let's get into this rant. So first of all, much to this series' credit, I do think that the premise of the series is interesting. The idea of lacing a Sherlockian mystery with some supernatural elements in there is quite compelling, and it could have worked really well. And I do think, to the show's credit as well, it builds the world of Victorian London very well as well, in order to act as this kind of backdrop for these types of stories. It all makes sense. I mean, you have the grim, the disgusting, grimy, depressing, horrible black grey London that's just filthy. Like, you can feel the filth of Victorian London in this series. It's palpable in its dirtiness and its griminess. So they've actualized that excellently. And I think that the show does a good job of interlacing some supernatural elements throughout these mysteries as well. I mean, you can tell that it's definitely a step up in terms of its budget, because when it does incorporate those CG elements, it looks, pretty good. Like, it looks Netflix level good. And so I was impressed to see that they actually pumped some money into this. Although I will say a lot of the heavy lifting is done not by the CG, but rather the kind of prosthetics and the props that are used in the series. Because there are times when I'm looking at an image of this show and I'm like, what is happening? Why is it so gruesome? Why is it so horrific and disgusting? So I'm actually really impressed to see what they were able to do with, props and with prosthetics in order to actualize the more gruesome elements of these mysteries and these crimes. But there is some CG in there, especially at the end of the series, where it becomes the beaming blue light, okay? It becomes the beaming blue light that we've seen time and time again in horror, in sci-fi, in comic book movies. So they're definitely actualizing that using CGI. That looks pretty impressive, even for a Netflix show. I will say, though, when it comes to realizing the world of Victorian England, England. An element that I often compliment when it comes to these series, and that being costuming, is actually something that lets the series down, in my opinion. I feel like we've seen time and time again series incorporating modern elements into historical pieces. We see it with shows like Dickinson, for example, where you do have those modern elements, whether it be through the music or through the costuming or through the language. And we see similar things here as well. But especially when it comes to the costuming, I personally didn't find that it worked, because the costuming felt like it didn't belong to any real era. Like sometimes when you have those intentional, modernizations inside of these projects, it feels intentional. It feels like it really stands out as something that makes the series unique. Whereas in this case, the anachronistic costume design annoyed the hell out of me. It annoyed the hell out of me. I was like, okay, so why is she wearing a bomber jacket? Why is she wearing denim? Why is she wearing, like, I was so annoyed. But not only the poor people, okay, because the poories, like, I can kind of make excuses for. But then you also have the aristocratic rich people, and you have these women dressed like they're in the 1950s when they're supposed to be in Victorian England. It makes no sense. You have women wearing backwards necklaces that look like they were designed in 2005. You have these tiaras that look like they come from Claire's. I was so angry. It seems like such a small petty point, okay, but because I wasn't having the best time overall, I started nitpicking on all of these little things, and the costume design just really wasn't my favorite. And like I said, that tends to be the one thing where I'm like, okay, at least you had good costuming. But when I think to shows like Dickinson, for example, this in comparison, please go home, go back to the drawing board. I think going back to the idea of, including these modernizations and this contemporary costuming as a part of this Victorian world, the main issue with the way that this show carries that out is that there's no specific reference point. Like I said, when it comes to the aristocratic women, it looks like they're wearing, evening gowns straight from the 40s and 50s. When it comes to the poor teenagers, some of them are wearing bomber jackets that look more akin to what you would find in Forever 21 today. So because there's no specific reference points when it comes to the eras of these costume designs, it doesn't feel as intentional as it should do. However, when it comes to using the contemporary language and music that this series does in order to kind of juxtapose that against the Victorian backdrop of this setting, I do think that it works a little bit better. Like I'm not angry. Like I said, I've become accustomed to this because more and more series and movies are doing this. So I'm not angry at the use of modern day slang and colloquialisms or the use of Billie Eilish on this series, although we will talk about in a second how this series kind of blends into the overall landscape of similar shows, especially on Netflix that we have seen recently. Okay, so now let's dive into some of the characters of this series real quick. Okay, I'm not going to be delving into them in much detail at all because I don't care. I don't care. I want to get to the complaining part, okay? So first off, yes, this series does seem to use some sort of colorblind casting technique where we have different characters of different races that are existing in this Victorian landscape, and I actually enjoy that quite a bit. We've seen this with other period pieces recently. It's kind of become the norm at this point, especially when it comes to period pieces that are set in England, because for the longest time, having a period piece meant that you would exclude a lot of people of color from the cast, or else they would be cast as slaves or servants, lowly people, nothing that would actually warrant them having speaking roles, basically. Like they wouldn't be well-written characters with actual arcs in these kinds of projects because it was set back in the day and the population of, POC people in England were non-existent, right? Wrong. That is wrong, and that is a lie that has been perpetuated by the lack of representation in these kind of period pieces that we see oftentimes in the UK. So wrong on that front, even though of course the population of people of color in the UK was much smaller 100, 200 years ago, they still were there. And even still, when you have a series that isn't supposed to be historically accurate, in a way that like a documentary is supposed to be, or a historical drama is supposed to be, when you have a series that already incorporates supernatural elements and a Sherlockian mystery, there's no issue with including people of color in that kind of story. Like we're already there, we're already using our imaginations, so why not extend our imaginations to having people of color be a part of the cast? However, having said that, okay, as generous as I have been, I have to say that for the most part, I didn't enjoy any of these characters. Any of these oh my god, what a miserable bunch. What a miserable bunch. I didn't have a fun time with most of these characters. And you know, let's just go ahead and rank the characters within the Irregulars since we're already here, okay? Because the character that I enjoyed the most by far, really just by far, was the character of Spike. Because at least he had some personality, at least he had some likability and some humor to him. Everyone else is being dragged through this storyline in the most reluctant, the most angst-ridden kind of way. These kids are supposed to be gifted. They're supposed to be special in the way that we've seen a bunch of kids be gifted and special in other series. Again, we'll talk about that in a second. But they're supposed to have that special quality to them that sets them apart from the rest of Victorian London, which is equally depressing and equally miserable. But no, they're just as miserable as the rest, especially when it comes to the character of B. And yes, there is a reason for that. She is in mourning. She does have a lot of, you know, troubles and a lot of struggles that she has to face as a young girl, especially because they used to be in the workhouses, which sucked, apparently sucked. So I understand why the character is so miserable, but it doesn't make for a very likable, compelling character to follow on this supernatural journey. So yes, I personally enjoyed the character of Spike the most. I love the way that he brought the team together. Yes, he was kind of the sprinkling of comedic-ish relief, at least as much as we're allowed to get on this series. But I enjoyed his interactions that he had with the team. A lot of the time, you know, some members of this team feel like they're on their own little independent side quest missions. As a result, sometimes the team doesn't really feel like a whole unit that kind of bonds together and works together towards a case, especially when the cases divulge into the, you know, overarching story that centers around the character of Jesse specifically. So when you have a character like Spike, he just helps to kind of bring the team together and keep that energy up, even though again a lot of the other characters need to be helping out with that heavy lifting because the load is very, very heavy. But then secondly, closely followed by Spike, I would say that Billy is also a cool character. Again, they work together really well in order to remind us what the root of this team is and where the heart of this team lies. Then you get into the character of Leo, who I would say is my third favorite. Interestingly enough, because here in Leo we have this kind of love story between him and the character of B, where he falls in love with her almost instantaneously, except Leo is secretly a prince. He is secretly the youngest, I believe, son of Queen Victoria. Now, Queen Victoria herself isn't really present in this series, and she doesn't really need to be, honestly, but Prince Leopold was an actual person. He was an actual prince. I believe he was her 8th child, and he did actually suffer from hemophilia, which was the kind of royal curse or the royal disease that Queen Victoria gave to a lot of her children as a result of years, generations of inbreeding, whatever. We don't have time to get into it. But essentially it did mean that their immune systems were quite weak, and it meant that if they were to be harmed or, you know, they suffered any gashes or scratches or anything of the sort, that their blood wouldn't clot. So it meant that they were more susceptible to dying of illness and infection and anything of the sort. And that's kind of significant when you're dealing with a prince who has that kind of disease and is wandering the streets of filthy London, filthy Victorian London. I swear to God, these kids were always covered in grime, covered in filth, and every single time I saw these kids like get hurt, like a gash, or there was blood, anything that happened, I just kept thinking, oh no, oh no, oh no, they're gonna die, not of the injury itself, but of infection. They're gonna die of infection straight up. At one point, B even gets a tattoo by the end of the series, and I'm like, oh no, B's gonna die of infection. Anyways, as I was saying, the relationship between B and Leo kind of took me by surprise because it very much mirrors the relationship that develops between another aristocratic boy and a Sherlockian style, a mystery solving girl in the form of Enola Holmes. And in that case, I was less of a fan of the relationship that developed between the two, whereas here I actually enjoyed the character of Leo quite a bit. Surprisingly, I think the actor did a really good job of balancing being this kind of aristocratic rich boy, okay, this rich white kid who was full of privilege. He couldn't really understand the struggles that people like B had come from. He manages to balance that out with a lot of charm and likability, at least in my opinion, especially in his naivete and the fish out of water kind of scenario that he's in. Speaking of B, I would say that she ranks next in terms of my ranking of the Irregulars themselves. I thought she was you know, like I thought, okay, here's the thing, okay, because I recognize this actress immediately from another series, another Netflix series surrounding children, okay, surrounding children running around, getting into trouble that they can't afford to get into, in the form of The Letter for the King from last year. Now, she plays a character called Iona, I believe, which is amazing. The fact that I was able to remember that, I'm sorry, but I'm so proud of myself. I'm so proud of myself, especially considering I did not like that series. I'm very proud that I was able to remember that name. But the reason why I was able to remember that name is because I actually liked her character in that show. And I also like the dynamic that she develops, spoiler alert, the dynamic that she develops with the villains of that series, because she ends up kind of crossing over to the bad side. But here, it seems as though even that cheekiness, even that kind of charisma is stripped away from the character because she is in mourning, because she is really angry and really bitter about her circumstances, rightfully so. Her life has sucked. Her life has absolutely sucked in Victorian England, but still it just makes it really tough to watch. And not only that, but she's also dealing with the burden of her sister's deteriorating mental state as a result of these supernatural elements and the visions that she's getting. So she's kind of like the mum of the group and the naggy kind of wife of the group, which is unfortunate because it means that as a young character who's going on these supernatural journeys and supernatural adventures, she can't really bask in that, you know, joy and in that wonder. She has to kind of be the responsible one that's rooted in their sour, dour reality. Okay, so next up, speaking of Bee's sister, she would be ranked last in my ranking of the Irregulars themselves because I truly disliked her. I truly disliked this character. This is very rare for me. It's very rare that I actually end up hating a character the way that I hated Jessie. I'm so sorry. What? She is the obligatory the one in the series, okay? The one with the powers, the 11 of the show, if you will. Don't worry, we'll talk about it. She's that kind of character, okay, which has been done time and time again. And so at this point, you need to give me something. You need to give me spice. You need to give me, you know, something to really sink my teeth into when it comes to the character work for that kind of character, because we've seen it so many times. But she gives me nothing at all. She gives me heavy breathing, she gives me panting and panic, she gives me open mouth breathing. I can't stress the breathing enough because that's literally all that the actress does. I'm so sorry, no offense to her, it's probably the direction, but I'm over it. Oh please. That cannot be the entirety of your personality. That can't be it. That literally, no. And the thing is that I feel bad because the show is trying to show us that this character used to be something else. Like, she used to have a personality. She used to be someone worth absolutely adoring in the way that her sister does, because her sister is all about trying to protect Jessie, trying to get her the help that she needs. That's why she goes on this journey in the first place and agrees to help John Watson with his cases, is because they're going to get paid so that she can get money for a doctor to help her sister. But the thing is that at the point that we meet her sister, she's already a lost cause. The sister's already a lost cause. She's already panting. She's already frantic. She's already a personality less kind of shell of her former self. So it's hard to get invested in the character because other than the fact that the story tells you to and the fact that she's Bee's sister, you don't really get a sense of why you should care about her. Honestly, like, I don't care. And since we're already ranking characters in this series and we're already in the correct order to begin with, let's go ahead and put in John Watson, because he would be next on my list of, you know, ranking the main characters. It was supposed to be ranking the Irregulars, but ranking the main characters now. John Watson is next. I really disliked this iteration of John Watson. I'm so angry that this is what they did with the character of John Watson. How do you mess up John Watson? How do you mess up? This series borrows a lot from other iterations of the Sherlock stories. For example, Guy Ritchie's Sherlock films is very much a reference of this series, I believe. You can definitely tell, especially at the beginning, with some of the musical choices and also the choices of editing and storytelling. They're using a little bit of that Guy Ritchie storytelling device, okay? I noticed because I'm a fan. So you can definitely tell that that's a reference point to some extent. But why not extend that over to the portrayal of John Watson by Jude Law? law, because his John Watson is excellent. Why did you just pick and choose some of the things that you wanted to do right from a Guy Ritchie Sherlock series, and you decided to completely ignore the excellent portrayal of John Watson? I've been saying this weekend, especially for Falcon and the Winter Soldier, you know, that's not my Cap, that's not my Captain America, John Walker, but in this case, that's not my John Watson. That is absolutely not my Dr. Watson, absolutely not. But leave him, throw him away. Throw him away. Near the end of the series, he becomes a little bit more bearable because he starts to develop, I don't know, a heart and a personality. We start to dig into who he really is, as opposed to this stoic, constantly angry and irritated person that we're presented with at the beginning of the series. But by that time, it's just too late, innit? Because you've already flopped. You've already made me sit through 8 episodes of this horrible character, and I'm angry at this point, so I'm not feeling quite forgiving. And speaking of being angry by portrayals of these classic characters, of which we have many iterations to draw inspiration from, Sherlock. How do you mess up Sherlock? How do you mess up Sherlock? At this point, like I said, how many iterations of Sherlock do we have? This property is in the public domain, so literally anyone can make any Sherlock thing that they want to. So they have. They very much have done so. So how do you mess up Sherlock himself? I really disliked this version of Sherlock. I understand, again, we're tapping into elements of grief, okay, and how it's destroyed this character. And also the elements of drug use are a part of the Sherlockian lore. Like, I get that. But what else is there to this character? He doesn't even seem like the world's best detective at this point. Like, at this point, it's not even a Sherlockian show. Like, it's not really his show. It's just a show about these teenagers who happen to tap into some supernatural elements, and they're kind of figuring out clues to mysteries and crimes. That doesn't necessarily have to be a Sherlock show at that point, because you've really flopped the character of Sherlock. How? How? He doesn't have the charisma. He doesn't have the magnetism. He's a miserable, miserable character who doesn't bear any resemblance to the Sherlock that we know and love. So how did you mess up Sherlock? How is my question. That's the true achievement of this series. The thing is, at the end of the day, the reason why we're being drawn into the series overall is because it's a Sherlock show. So perhaps maybe if you just introduce us to the character of Sherlock himself, establish him as the unique consulting detective that he is, and then maybe kind of have him disappear due to these supernatural elements that are at play here, and have the kids, you know, try and find out what happened to him, and John Watson kind of employ their help on that front, then maybe you have a story where it feels still very much a part of the Sherlock world, but it has that added twist of being, you know, a supernatural story with these kids at the center of the mystery. Like, then you would be able to have your cake and eat it too. But the way that they've done it is excluding Sherlock for the majority of the show, and then when he is introduced, he just makes for a very disappointing, depressing, just boring character that adds nothing to the field, okay, to the landscape of Sherlock iterations. And speaking of fields and landscapes, this now brings me to the biggest issue, the biggest qualm that I have with this series, and that is there is absolutely nothing unique, special, individual, innovative about this show. This series reads to me as if someone over at Netflix headquarters allowed the algorithm to choose elements of series that are already quite popular, already quite popping on the platform, to make an entire new show. This series feels like an amalgamation of Netflix isms, okay? You know, elements of different popular Netflix series that have just been chucked into a pot and mixed together by the algorithm in order to regurgitate a brand new series that will hopefully be popping in the top 10 for the next couple of weeks. That's what this series feels like to me. There is absolutely nothing individual about it, and we'll go through some of the shows, especially from the Netflix platform itself, that it reminds me of. Already I've touched on some of them, and I was trying hard not to because I didn't want to draw comparisons before we got to this section of this review, but it's inevitable because there's nothing unique. Like, everything has been done before. So first up, I already mentioned how the inclusion of Graham, who portrays B in this series, very much reminded me of the character of Iona, who she also portrays in The Letter for the King. And overall, I get very similar The Letter for the King vibes with this show, especially as it centers around these teenage characters that are embarking on this, you know, supernatural journey. There are definite elements there that remind me of that series, as well as the overall aesthetic of the show, even though The Letter for the King is kind of set in this medieval period as opposed to a Victorian one. But there are a lot of parallels parallels there to be drawn from already. So that's number one. Letter for the King, easy reference to make. Then of course we have the fact that it's a Sherlock story. Okay, we have another iteration of a Sherlock story, as I said. And yes, of course, this brings to mind another recent iteration of a Sherlock story from Netflix itself, Enola Holmes, where instead of focusing on the character of Sherlock himself and him solving mysteries, we instead have a story centered around his sister, Enola Holmes, who's portrayed by Millie Bobby Brown. We'll talk about that in a second. But like I said, we have a lot of parallels with Enola Holmes, the Netflix movie, to The Irregulars, the Netflix series. I mean, the fact that it's a Sherlock story, the fact that you have this kind of teenage group of people who are solving mysteries instead of Sherlock himself, and of course that added element of the relationship that develops between B and Leo, who is this guy from the aristocracy, much like the guy from Enola Holmes, although to be fair, like I said, I prefer Leo in that case. But speaking of Millie Bobby Brown, we also have a very 11-esque character in Jessie. She is the one of the series, the one with the superpowers, the one who is destined to tap into the supernatural world. So we have a lot of parallels with that, as well as the, what was it called? The Rip that's at the end of the series. You know, this kind of whole this interdimensional portal that develops somewhere underground somehow throughout the series, and it allows people from other dimensions, including B and Jessie's mother, to come into their dimension, the dimension of the living. And then her plan is to allow the Rip to open up so that the dimension of the undead, I guess purgatory, it kind of seeps into reality. But then that makes that makes the residents of London who like pray and have hope or whatever become monsters. Because yeah, that happens. Basically what I'm saying is it's very reminiscent of Stranger Things overall. And when it comes to the character of Jessie herself, the astral projection side of her powers is also very reminiscent of the recent Behind Her Eyes, which I didn't get a chance to review, but let me just say that series is crazy. But just in general, overall, the feel of the show was giving me very The Winx Saga. It was giving me very The Witcher, Cursed from last year. Like, there are a lot of Netflix series that this was very reminiscent of. And like I said, it just feels like an amalgamation, a mishmash of, you know, popular elements and popular tropes that we've seen in other popular Netflix series, just banded together in this puddle of mediocrity. That overall made for a very unremarkable and derivative young adult series. So with all of that being said, I'm going to be giving The Irregulars a 5 out of 10. So that's it from me. Now that I told you guys my thoughts on The Irregulars, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of this series down in the comments below. Hey, maybe you guys enjoyed it. Okay, I don't know. Maybe I'm just bugging. Okay, but I felt like that show was tough to get through. But please be sure to subscribe to my channel to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.